You know what you're listening to?
Is that a trick question?
It's the I Still Love This Game podcast with your host, Matthew Damian.
He's an idiot. Don't listen to this. He's an idiot.
Hello and welcome to the I Still Love This Game podcast. My goodness, it has been a while. It has been a long time. I just realized how long it had been when I was just doing the introduction. I nearly forgot the name of the episode. Been doing a lot of other podcasts, been a guest on a lot of them, been a guest on some radio. Obviously, with the Jordan book just releasing, people have wanted to talk about Michael Jordan and the 1990s Chicago Bulls. And it got me thinking just at this very second, the last time I did a solo podcast, well, it had to be in the Kobe Bryant episode. It had to have been. And even then, it's been a long time. So if you date back to from like the last 11 months, because I was doing some for the finals, but really the last 11 months, I've probably done about 5 solo podcasts, which is crazy to me because I used to do these all the time by myself. So if I'm rusty, I apologize. But this is something that I knew I was going to do something special for this Bulls documentary, The Last Dance. And from the moment I heard about it, I think it was announced really in 2018, and it was announced on Netflix. So it was going to be a Netflix thing, and then it kept changing and went to ESPN. Then it was going to be out in June, and then it was going to be out in April. Now, of course, I'm not complaining. It was fantastic so far. But the one thing that caught me by surprise, is how excited people have been about this. And the documentary itself, like, to me, you know, I love 90s basketball, I love 80s basketball, I love early 2000s basketball. Not a huge fan of the current day product, but if you are a fan of my show, you'll understand why. But the reaction to this, the excitement to this, is truly remarkable. And it's really because of Jordan. Like, let's be honest. I mean, yeah, there's Rodman is in there, Phil Jackson is in there, Scottie's in there, obviously, and we just saw quite a bit of Larry Bird towards the end too. So there are a lot of prominent figures, Hall of Fame figures in this. But Jordan is really the person that everybody is gravitating to because they want to hear about him. And I've made the comparison of Jordan being more of, you know, if you saw the Dark Knight trilogy, the Batman trilogy, if you've seen the third one and you saw how Bruce Wayne was acting, it kind of reminded you, like, Jordan sort of escaped a little bit, especially after everything that happened in Washington. Now, is he still a public figure? Of course he is. Does he still make appearances? Absolutely. But where he was, and the documentary, and I'll get to this in a minute because the documentary definitely touched on this, but where he was in terms of being in the spotlight, he definitely got his space that he needed. And it's interesting, as I said, it's interesting to see the reaction because sports media over the last 5 years, ever since LeBron went back to Cleveland, has been sort of trying to build up this passing of the torch moment for LeBron. Clearly hasn't been warranted, by the way. But there's been a notion to sort of attack Jordan's legacy. And now you're starting to see a lot of those figures, those sports journalists, lack of a better term, because I don't really classify them as journalists. They're more of an activist than anything, because they have a clear agenda in mind. But a lot of them have sort of really been pushing for this and being excited and talking about it. We'll see how quickly they will change their stance. That will be something interesting. But back to the documentary, because I'm sure that's what you wanted to hear. And here I was, I remember Matt Crow, childhood friend of mine, who I still keep very close contact with. Matt, I know you're listening to the show. It's always good to keep in touch with you. I remember him asking me if I was excited for it. And I said I was a little bit hesitant for it because I didn't want to do a fact checking. I don't want to be that guy, the guy that has to fact check it. But there were some things that I noticed that maybe required a little bit further explanation. And the very first thing that I noticed was when Jordan was drafted by the Bulls, one of the quotes that he actually said was he just wanted the Bulls to be respected. He talked about the Lakers, he talked about the Celtics and the 76ers and the other teams in the NBA at that time that were respected ball clubs. He just wanted the Bulls to be respected. So even at that young age, it was all about winning to him. It's very easy to get caught up in his individual talents and think, well, the game was just easy to him or whatever. But at its core, at Jordan's core, it was always about winning. And I think that's why, he's so revered up until this day. And it's not just specific to just one generation. It's multi-generations. And that's why there's a clear difference between him and pretty much anyone else that's ever played. The other question that came up into my mind is how long could it have lasted? There was a quote there from, I think it was Krause, and it's funny because we referred to as Crumbs, Jerry Crumbs, because he was just kind of a pig eater, so they called him Jerry Crumbs for a long period of time. It's funny because I've done a lot of research on the Bulls, obviously when I was writing my book, and I'll see how many times I can plug my book in here. We should do a drinking game, shots for every time that I plug my book. No, but when I was doing a lot of that research, a lot of these stories aren't new to me. But it's so different, so much more powerful when you can actually see the body language. You can see the emotion when people are saying it to you. Or even hearing their voice saying it, as opposed to reading, Roland Lazenby's book or David Halberstam's book, both of which, I'm very proud of my book, but those books, if you want to learn about the 1990s Bulls, The Life by Roland Lazenby and and also Blood on the Horns by Roland Lazenby, are great books, but the number one basketball book that I've ever read in my entire life is called Playing for Keeps by David Halberstam. It is remarkable. One of the great books you'll ever come across in your entire life. Anyway, I got a little bit off topic there, excuse me. But in terms of, I think it was Jerry Krause who was mentioning that after the 97 season, with the exception of Jordan, he felt like a lot of those players were ready to decline. Pippen, Rodman, maybe not Kukoc. Kukoc was still fairly young. Harper was ready to decline as well. Longley, he was pretty stable. He wasn't really a star player anyway. So he was hesitant to give out massive contracts to those players, especially as they were free agents. And it made me wonder, though, because one, he had a point, because Pippen was never an all-star again after 97, and Rodman, he was clearly not the same player he was in 96, and he never really he was still a great rebounder, pretty good low post defender, but he just didn't have the same energy levels, the same focus. And Jordan really carried them throughout that entire season. I think, as much as I loved, I always thought that Jordan from 91 to 93 was his prime. But my favorite edition of Jordan was the 98 Jordan. And it's just because it showed how much, how well he had mastered the game from a mental standpoint, a psychological standpoint, and we'll get to that in a minute too. But it made me wonder how long they could have gone. I think they could have won in 99 because they were going up against Duncan. They were going up against who was only in his second year. David Robinson wasn't quite the same MVP level David Robinson, and I really think the Spurs would have really struggled getting the ball up across mid-court with that Bulls defense, because the Bulls are an excellent trapping team. As I mentioned, you had Harper, Pippen, Jordan, who could press, and then you had Randy Brown who could come off the bench and could press. You only had Avery Johnson, and I my very first book that I wrote, these guys matched up against each other in the first round. It was the greatest team of all time playoff bracket, and the reason I said the Bulls would win, and quite convincingly, was because you're now relying on essentially second-year point guard Antonio Daniels to get the ball up across midcourt. And then once you do that, you've spent so much time getting the ball up and advancing it across midcourt. You got like 15 seconds to get the ball into Duncan or Robinson. All you got to do is double once, and the shot clock's under 10 seconds. So you're really rushing an offense against an excellent defensive team. So I think the Bulls would have won that. I think they could have won against the 2000 Lakers. Not the 2001 Lakers, but the 2000 Lakers. I think they could have gone all the way to 5 in a row. Because the 2000 Lakers, they wouldn't have Phil Jackson, because obviously Phil Jackson is still with the Bulls in this hypothetical. And Kobe wasn't quite Kobe. And Shaq was dominant, but Phil Jackson's impact wouldn't have been applied because Phil Jackson is still with the Bulls. Now, if somehow Phil Jackson is on both the Bulls and the Lakers, I still go with the Bulls in this case, because you saw how much the Lakers struggled against a very old Scottie Pippen, and he was on Portland, and Portland was a deep team, but they didn't have Jordan, and they pushed them to 7 games. So if you still got that Pippen, and you got Dennis Rodman, you got Jordan, you got Kukoc, you got Harper, you got Phil Jackson, it makes a lot of sense that they would still be able to win, because Portland nearly knocked them off. So I still think that they would have won that. 2001, no. I think 2001 would have been the passing of the torch moment, especially as Kobe really developed into the player that he was. Shaq was even more dominant in the playoffs than he was the year prior. And then you had the maturation of guys like Derek Fisher, Rick Fox, Robert Horry, Horace Grant was on that team. I think that 2001 Lakers team would have beaten the Bulls if they were in 2001. And that would have been the passing of the torch moment. So that's how far I think they would have gone. It's kind of funny to think, like, because what's the flip side? They wanted to rebuild as quickly as possible. How did that rebuild go? The rebuild went pretty bad. I mean, at 2001, where were the Bulls at that point? They were picking second in the lottery and drafting Tyson Chandler, which wasn't a bad pick, by the way, but they didn't exactly hit the ground running with that rebuild process. So if they had moved a year ahead in the rebuild process and started in 98 as opposed to 99, what difference would it have made? So Jordan was right about that. Another thing, Scottie Pippen, described as a talented scorer and a great leader. Very interesting words. Scottie Pippen could score in bursts and was a pretty good leader, but the very first thing you would describe Scottie Pippen as from a basketball standpoint is an excellent defender, an unbelievable defender. That is his forte. I don't know why J.A. Adunde went with that. The distractions from within and from management, it was interesting. Like any great dynasty, whether it was the Roman one, whether it was the Greeks, or whether it was, you look at, from the channels of history, they will often refer to how the division comes from within. And this was, Charles Barkley will often say and refer to his 93 team and saying how his teammates started after they made the finals in 93. They started wanting the bigger piece of the pie. Whereas here, it wasn't necessarily the players, although, once again, we'll get to that in a minute. It was more of the management wanting more attention. And you would expect a little bit more maturity, just a little bit more maturity from those. The organizations win championships quote. Very polarizing thing, because in a way he's right. They do play their role. But as Jordan said in his Hall of Fame speech, he didn't see, the general manager out there playing with the flu or with a bad back like Scottie Pippen did in 98. So, once again, it's very immature from Krause. I think a lot of those problems, Krause was very good at his job and he knew he was very good, but he caused a lot of problems that just didn't need to be, a lot of distractions that just didn't need to be there. I mean, this team had enough attention on it as it was. It was under the biggest spotlight, worldwide spotlight, at a time when this was not precedent. This is not, the digital age back then. This was, you still, if you try to get tape of the games, it is literally tape. That hasn't been digitalized yet. So it's still a physical media age back then. The internet was around, but it was definitely not where you went to get your media. How people consume media was the television. For them to have that kind of spotlight on them in that period is ridiculous. And the Tim Floyd thing. Tim Floyd. I remember Jason Williams, of all people. Not White Chocolate, but the All-Star New Jersey Nets center, who's quite infamous, and I'm not going to get into those reasons, but he wrote a book and he summed it up perfectly. He's saying that, if you've got the choice between Michael Jordan, greatest player of all time, maybe the greatest coach of all time in Phil Jackson, or a rookie head coach in the NBA, it's kind of an easy decision. But, I won't repeat the language that he used to describe, unless if you're insert expletive right there. But they went with that. They wanted to go with that a year early. Why? Like, it's such an ego thing. It's ridiculous. And usually you could say, well, both sides are at fault here. I really don't think so. If you're Phil Jackson, why would you take less money than Rick Pitino has? And he's not even the coach I'm referring to in terms of, obviously, Tim Floyd was the one they were trying to bring in, but Rick Pitino was earning insane amounts. Calipari was earning insane amounts. Why should they get paid more than what Phil Jackson is? And when you look at Phil Jackson's body of work, that's incredible. Moving ahead, this documentary goes, it chops, it's not linear, so it goes from 97 to 98 to back to the early beginnings of this dynasty, which is of course Jordan being drafted. But then it goes to the McDonald's tournament, and I thought it was very interesting to see, because it hasn't been talked about the impact that McDonald's tournament had on global basketball. We often hear about what the Dream Team did for global basketball, but it looked like it was a similar sort of situation. And all of that attention was on Jordan, because you had a starting lineup of Tony Kukoc, who would have been fairly popular because he was in Europe, although France is nowhere near Croatia. But you would have had Tony Kukoc, Luke Longley, Jordan, Jason Caffey, and Ron Harper. That would have been the starting five. Who do you think's getting all the attention in that situation? And at that point of his career, I don't think Jordan was really all that interested in that kind of attention. I think he was just focused on winning. He was always focused on winning, but I think at that point he might have been over that kind of attention. Whereas in 92, it was a drain on him anyway, but that was 5 years ago. If this was 87, I'm sure he would have responded very differently to that. The intensity of Roy Williams when he talked about Jordan, that stood out to me, because Roy Williams, he's seen a lot. He's been around greatness. And for him to, if you go back and watch that episode, when you look at Roy Williams when he's talking about when Jordan could be the best player of all time if he worked hard enough, and he worked hard enough, check out the intensity in that guy's face when he's talking about that. That struck me very quickly. The hotel room scene, and I feel this might become one of the most talked about scenes out of this whole thing. And I don't doubt it for 1 second, especially when you've got guys like Orlando Woolridge, and I'm not sure if Reggie Theus was on that team, but you got some players that have had a history of this stuff. But what struck me during this was how quickly, how different this whole thing could have worked out if Jordan had accepted their invitation. That could have derailed Jordan. It could have killed Jordan. Look at Len Bias. It could have derailed his career. And the course of history completely changes. Not just from an NBA standpoint, but everything changes at in that situation. The relationship between Scott Burrell and Ron Harper. I'm not sure if that's going to get brought up a whole lot, but Scott Burrell was traded to the Bulls in the offseason, the 97 offseason, so leading to the 97-98, and that was considered insurance, essentially, for Pippen if Pippen never came back, or just added depth. Now, Scott Burrell, very talented guy, very talented player, never worked really hard on his game until he would play for the Bulls. And you could see very clearly what Jordan respected and what he didn't respect. And it came down to leadership. And there was a situation when, they won the McDonald's championship, of course. And Ron Harper was sort of making fun of him and saying, this is your first championship, because obviously he just joined the Bulls. And he wanted a hug from Jordan, and Jordan did not hug him at all. Jordan just laughed at him. Now, Jordan, I think, and this is where I can understand where Jordan was talking about, like, maybe some people won't like him after seeing this, because he did everything to build a culture based all about winning, right? And then some other guys that are coming in that are new to this, they have to adapt to what Jordan has built, to what Phil Jackson has built, to what Scottie Pippen has built. Because if they don't force them to adapt, and like this nonchalant joking around sort of situation with Burrell, who hasn't put the hard work in, who continued to not work really hard in training, then that could create a situation where it undermines everything they have done. And I can understand Jordan not wanting that culture to change one bit. So I thought that was very interesting. They sort of alluded to Pippen as well. I'm sure we'll be talking about that in a moment as well. But the Pippen situation, where Pippen wanted out, he was very unhappy with the Bulls and his contract, but he still stayed very close to the team. He was still a part of team huddles. He was still showing up to practices, still showing up to scrimmages, still working out before games, things of that nature. Moving along to the addition of Scottie Pippen. And it was fascinating to watch just how raw this guy was when he came out and he went into the NBA. He was very, very thin. His body hadn't developed, and his skills, he was a decent ball handler for his size, but his skills were not quite to the level that you would have expected based off what you saw him later on in his career, where he was so fluid. But the athleticism, my goodness. There was very little talk about Horace Grant in that, who was also drafted in that same draft class by the Bulls. And I think that is the really disturbing thing that was overlooked when they were talking about Pippen being underpaid and underappreciated wasn't even the underpaying part, but the fact that they would also actively shopping him. And what I mean by that is I can understand, you sign a contract, especially if Reinsdorf, who's the Bulls owner, is saying, I don't think you should sign this contract, I think you should wait. And if he goes ahead and still wants to sign a 7-year deal, then Reinsdorf is well within his rights to not be open to renegotiate that. You're a man of your word. You've signed it. It's not even a man of your word. You've actually bound yourself from a legal standpoint. So it makes perfect sense for Reinsdorf to not budge on this. That's one thing. The other thing, but for them to actually be actively shopping him at that stage is even worse. It's not even saying, hey, we're going to let you play out your contract. And I get it, they're still allowed to do that, but that's still very disrespectful because he's still breaking the team up at that point. Now, if Pippen was earning 30 million or 20 million, or, if he was a max player at that time, I could understand them trying to move away from him as quickly as possible if he was starting to decline. But I guarantee you, Scottie Pippen, when they say he was a top 5 player in the NBA at that point, they were not lying. Now, was there a difference between him and Jordan? Absolutely. But Pippen was still top 5. Because to me, I hate the term two-way player, because basketball is a two-way sport. So Pippen wasn't just a top 5 two-way player. He was a top 5 player overall. And there's no question he was a top 5 player, but yet he was ridiculously underpaid. It was almost insulting. And it's funny because when you look at, I'm not even talking from a relative standpoint, what this guy, the value that he brought into that organization, he was definitely underpaid. Now, I did say that the Bulls did not have to renegotiate one thing, but there was a little bit, and a lot of you guys might not know this, but there was a little bit of a contradiction in the way they handled Pippen as opposed to Jordan. So Jordan signed a fairly long-term deal as well, and this is before he returned in 95. I had to think about that for a second. But before he returned in 95. So Jordan was not the highest paid player in the NBA at that point. I think Larry Johnson was for a long period. And when he did retire, obviously the Bulls didn't have to pay him because he wasn't playing anymore, right? But Reinsdorf felt he got such a good deal on that he ended up paying Jordan's salary for the 94 and the 95 season. So it's kind of a contradiction there when you're thinking about, the Bulls, their right to not budge with Pippen at all, but yet they were so willing to be accommodating and do the classy moves with Reinsdorf. Now, the cynic in me is probably thinking, well, maybe Reinsdorf did that because otherwise Jordan's contract would be void after one season of not playing, and then he could have gone wherever he wanted, and the Bulls would have lost him completely. Maybe that's the reason why Reinsdorf kept paying him and kept that contract active. As the Bulls struggled in the 97-98 season, what you saw was Jordan's leadership really come through. And it's interesting to see how much he took a step back from a leadership standpoint and allowed Pippen to be a much more vocal locker room leader. And because we've often seen how Pippen became the primary defender on the Bulls team because he wasn't the same scorer that Jordan was. So they sort of managed Jordan on the defensive end. It wasn't as bad as what LeBron is now, where LeBron will just take entire games off defensively. But you would have seen, at times Jordan was really the third defender behind Harper as well. Because you could let those guys defend and let Jordan focus on scoring, and then if Jordan had to step up defensively, Jordan would step up defensively. But from a leadership standpoint, it looked like Jordan may have taken a step back a little bit in 96 and 97 and allowed Pippen to really come into his own. And then maybe that was a huge void that Jordan had to fill in as well, not just the production on the court to make up for Pippen's absence, but also the leadership off the court. That was surprising to me. The broken foot. So it jumps back now to Jordan's second season. So it's kind of funny how they're doing this. But they were talking about the broken foot in Jordan's second season. And I thought that was a little bit ironic because when you think about it, Sam Bowie was drafted just ahead of Jordan. Everyone says that's the worst draft pick of all time. It's hard to argue with that, right? Especially when you look at the injuries for Sam Bowie. Now, what happened with Bowie was a consistent breaking of his foot. It's kind of ironic that Jordan was very close to going down that same path when he broke his foot. And it's led to a watershed moment between Jordan and management over his return. And think about the position the Bulls management are in at this point. They have not had a successful franchise. They have never had a winning culture there. all of a sudden they have a guy there that's turned that on its head really within one season. And now all of a sudden you've got a guy who's injured. He could be the greatest player of all time, ended up becoming the greatest player of all time, but at that point they didn't know. He could be the greatest player of all time. But you don't want to risk, especially when you're going to be an 8 seed at best. But even then, they really weren't even in playoff contention. But you know, it must have been very appealing to go for the draft pick, because back then it wasn't even an odds thing. It was just if you missed the playoffs, you had equal odds. So if you had the worst record in the league, or if you just missed the playoffs by one game, you had an equal opportunity to get in the number 1 pick in the draft. So that must have been very, very tempting for a Bulls organization that was like, what have we got here with Jordan? Let's build around that. Who knows? We could get a top 3 pick and we could really go from there. Now, the other side of it, though, is do you derail Jordan's commitment and loyalty to a franchise by doing this? Because Jordan is all about winning. And if he feels like, hey, I'm ready to go, I want to get back into the playoffs, let's continue the momentum, let's keep going with this. The Bulls really risked not just losing Jordan, they had to weigh up between losing Jordan physically with the foot injury as opposed to maybe losing Jordan mentally from a loyalty standpoint. So, but the clash with management also shows the Bulls, they were ruthless with absolutely everybody. It wasn't just Pippen and it wasn't just Jackson, but it was also Jordan. When the whole risk-reward thing, they let Jordan get away with a lot more than they let Pippen get away with. But at the same time, they were also very, very much aware of what they wanted. And they were just as stubborn and as hard-headed as what Jordan ever was. But getting away from some of the behind the scenes stuff, it goes into that playoff series where between the 86 Celtics, maybe a top 3 team of all time, you can make an argument quite honestly that they were the greatest team of all time, up against the Bulls that have won 30 games. And a couple of things came to my mind in all of that. First of all, he drops 49 in the first game, and they still lost by 18 points, which is incredible. Absolutely incredible to think about, right? He comes back and he scores 63 in the second. Think about this for a second. He averaged 56 points per game in the first 2 games in Boston Garden in the playoffs against maybe the best team of all time, if not a top 3 team of all time. And he was out there by himself. He was essentially a rookie because he missed so much of that season, that second season. That is incredible. And the scary thing, you can say, well, they didn't win the game. But the scary thing is, if you go back and watch that, at the end of that game, the Bulls are down by 2. Jordan is dribbling the ball up the court. He shoots a 3 and McHale fouls him. Now, obviously, it goes into double overtime, so you're thinking, well, Jordan made 2 out of 3. That's not the case. They had an antiquated rule back then that if you were fouled, like, you can still get a 4-point play. Like, if Jordan made the shot, he would get a foul shot, right? If he made the 3. So you can still get a 4-point play. But if you were fouled behind the 3-point line and you were shooting a 3, you didn't get 3 free throws, which is absolutely insane. So he only got 2 of them. Of course, he made them both. But if that rule was just and up to date, there's a good chance the Bulls walk out of there with a split. And they had only lost 1 time in the entire regular season at home, and that was to Portland. That they looked completely untouchable at home. And for a team that, that shows you just how crazy that is. And then Jordan doesn't go on to get 63. I don't know what his point total would have been at that point. I don't think he cares. I just think he wanted to win. So that's a little bit of context to apply to that. And what I wanted to finish up on, though, is Boston Garden, even more so than the Forum, because a lot of the Lakers' history now is actually from Staples Center. But Boston Garden The only one Celtics championship has not been at the Garden, and that was 2008. So Boston Garden really is the home of basketball dominance. Maybe not basketball history, but basketball dominance. And you think of all the great players that have played for the Celtics and even opposition that played there in big moments in the NBA Finals. So you're talking Bill Russell, you're talking about Bob Cousy, you're talking about Dave Cowens, you're talking about Havlicek, you're talking about Larry Bird, McHale. All those guys that have played there, and then all the guys that have played against them, from West to Baylor to Kareem to Magic, obviously. All these iconic, Dr. J as well, all these iconic players. And it's hard to think of a more iconic performance by somebody than what Jordan did in that game too, even though it was a loss. So that is just incredible. And, Larry Bird summed it up best when he said, I think that was God, Michael Jordan disguised as God out there. So it was just, we had never seen anything like that as basketball fans leading into that. It was quite obvious because this was the absolute great, the absolute standard of basketball was the Boston Celtics. And for them to barely withhold that kind of, or resist that kind of force, shows exactly how great Jordan was, even at that stage of his career. It's ridiculous to think about how good he was at such a young age. And that is in spite of management problems, which, you talk about pettiness. It clearly wasn't just a 1998 thing. This is a 1986 problem too. So they still have problems between management and coaches. You have problems with the players. You have problems with the supporting cast. You had all kinds of issues, and yet he was able to almost overcome all of that and get a split in the great Boston Garden against maybe the best team of all time. There was 5 Hall of Famers there, not 4. That was, talk about fact checking, they screwed up that because they didn't even mention Walton. Now, Walton wasn't at his prime, that's fair, but you still had Larry Bird, McHale, Parrish, Dennis Johnson, and Bill Walton. That's 5 Hall of Famers. That is one hell of a lineup. Anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed what I saw. Not a whole lot of it was new to me, but I still enjoyed it. I'm going to enjoy, as I said, watching some of the reactions from the Jay Williams and the Jalen Roses and those guys. Well, not so much Jalen Rose. He's been consistent with what he said, but a lot of people that have been so quick to say that, Jordan, isn't as good as LeBron and all this other stuff. It'll be interesting to see what their reaction is, whether they can withstand, because the public, I think overall, the public sentiment has always been that Jordan's by far and away the greatest player of all time. That hasn't changed. But in terms of the social media bubbles out there, I think there has been a lot more movement towards Camp LeBron on that. And that, I think that's what they're catering to. But after this documentary really starts, you could even start to make some of those arguments now. But as more people start seeing this visual footage of it, it'll be interesting to see how much they will resist that kind of sentiment change, or will they resist it all, or will they capitulate and start admitting, or not admitting, but changing their points of view on it. It'll be interesting to watch. Anyway, I've rambled on for far too long, nearly as long as one of the episodes. So hope you enjoyed it. There'll probably be another episode coming up this week because I want to get TJ and Mike Fry on, hopefully all at the same time, and we can all discuss what we saw. I hope you guys are doing well. Stay safe out there. This is definitely an odd period of time for us all, but staying safe is obviously the most important thing. Look after yourself. The book has been released. Shoot me an email if you can't afford it. It's okay. I'm not a total prick, so if you can't afford it and you've been a fan of the show, shoot me an email. I'll send you a copy. I don't care. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think of it. And I will see you guys in the next episode.